Hi everyone, my name is Patty and I'll be doing my presentation on When Does Corporate Irresponsibility Become News by Samuel Stabler and Mark Fisher. So kind of an overview of the study, they studied 77 big news outlets in multiple countries. They looked at major corporations in the United States, the UK, Mexico, France, and Germany with some overlap. There were some individual brands from each country and then there was some overlap with a couple brands in each country, and some of the big ones that were obviously in all of them were Apple, Coca-Cola, and Volkswagen. They looked at 1,500 or 1,053 corporate social irresponsibility events. That's CSI is corporate social irresponsibility events. And they looked at the relationship between the company and the press. Like if there was a relationship between how the company related to the press and if they were more likely to report on it. In the Q&A, they did mention that they didn't really account for other big news as like a variable, like if there was less report they were less likely to report if there was something else really big going on in the news at the time. But so they didn't, it was not a variable, but they did control for it as best as they could. Some of the key cases that kind of brought up this event was obviously everyone knows about Volkswagen. They had that huge pollution scandal and their share prices dropped 30%. Pretty much every corporation was reporting on that at the time. But an interesting kind of turn was the JP Morgan versus Goldman Sachs. They're both banking companies. They had a very similar corporate social irresponsibility incident with some of their practices, but there was considerably more media coverage on Goldman and versus JP Morgan, and it led to a considerably greater drop in their stocks. So it's kind of, the question is, how do journalists select these news? You know, what makes it a good story, and why do they pick Goldman Sachs so incredibly over JP Morgan? So the three major issues they looked at for corporate social irresponsibility were the environmental, so issues with nature and animals, social irresponsibility, so human rights, discrimination, bad working conditions, and those kind of things with their employees, and overall governance, so misconduct within social norms and society rules with the way they're running their company. So these are kind of the study results. I took this straight from there because it was summarized beautifully. You can see like the 4 things they looked at was, on average, 1 out of 5 outlets cover a CSI event, but only 1 out of 10 cover it if the story involved the brand as a selective advertising partner. So if the brand had a partnership with the media, they were a lot less likely to cover it. So that's kind of concerning. There was much more coverage on salient versus strong brands. So you're lower likelihood of getting bad press if you were a salient brand, and a higher likelihood of getting bad press if you had a really strong brand like Coca-Cola. And then another super interesting one was you were 80% more media report if it's a foreign brand involved in a domestic CSI incident. So if Ford had done the same thing that Volkswagen had did, there would be a lot less media than Volkswagen, who is a foreign company in the United States. And then left-oriented media outlets are more likely to report CSI events than right-oriented outlets, which I also found super interesting. They said in the presentation, like right-winged, I think it was the corporate social responsibility is like the mortal enemy of like left-wing outlets or something, but I found that super interesting. And then kind of taking those study results into the stock market. So the stock market only reacts badly if 4 or more of the major US media companies report it. If you have less than that, your stock isn't going to drop nearly as much. And it is worse if your brand is salient, like they said, or it's a domestic corporate social irresponsibility versus it's worse if it's a domestic thing and you're a foreign thing. And then one way to make the stock market not drop as badly would be to launch your own brand advertising. So if you get like media out coverage of your own brand that is positive stuff, is going to help kind of counteract that corporate social irresponsibility news a lot. Or if you advertise in the time of crisis, create a new product, bring something to market, so you can counteract a lot of bad press with some good press, and it works pretty well, actually. So some of the takeaways for companies, so if you are a corporation looking at this kind of stuff and you want to use this for your advantage, corporate social responsibilities are obviously really not evenly covered. So you kind of have to watch to see how your company is going to be covered. The research that I kind of explained in this, you can kind of use that to predict how bad the incident, if something does go wrong and you are going to have an irresponsibility leak to the news, you can kind of use this to predict how much you need to prepare, how much you need to kind of weigh back with other advertising and that kind of stuff. And then your own brand can help kind of counteract the bad report. Like I said, if you produce something really good, it counteracts that bad news. So a way to kind of counteract this is using local brand names in foreign countries. So as opposed to using Volkswagen everywhere across the world, if you use a individual name for each country, a more local thing, that can kind of help keep your brand in other countries a little safer. And then strong brands doesn't help much as you think. You'd kind of think, oh, if Coca-Cola has an incident, it's not as bad because they're Coke, everyone still drinks them. But if they have an incident, because they have that strong brand, it kind of works as a disadvantage. And then advertising investment does help. So if you advertise with the press, that's going to help your company not do as badly and not be covered as much with these corporate social responsibility incidents, which leads into what it means to society. So investors really do care about these corporate social irresponsibility things. We're kind of in a time where corporations really need to be doing really great stuff, and they really can't have these mishaps if they want to keep their investors super engaged and giving them more money. So it's really important that you don't have these irresponsibilities leaked and you don't do them at all in the first place. The effectiveness of media is kind of a question here. So you see that like there's obviously huge gaps in how irresponsibilities are reported. So it kind of makes you question how effective is our media? How much can we trust the media that we're getting on a lot of these issues? You know, what are we missing out there? What brands are kind of doing things irresponsibly that's just getting swept under the rug because they have these deals with these press companies? And it's a little concerning for what's getting reported in the news and how much we can trust our news itself. And this leads into an advertising dollars issue. So if you are working with these companies, if you are kind of paying off the press to not report on your company, does there need to be some sort of policy here? This report it wasn't structured enough to be able to give an exact policy to implement, but that is something that we should be looking at in the future. Should there be a policy? Should there be something from the government, from legislation that is preventing this from happening, so these corporations can't just pay their way out of the irresponsible things that they're doing? So that's something that we can kind of look at in the future and going forward. And yeah, that's all. Thanks for listening to my presentation on how corporate social irresponsibility gets into the news.